So this next session is a session I was so excited about. It's a session of friends, people who, some of whom I've known for decades. And we're going to be, again, talking about nature with a little bit of a different approach. And I'm very excited to have Tom McHenry as our host of the session. He was dean and head of the Vermont Law School, has been in private legal practice. And then we have Jim Lyons, who I've known since the Clinton administration when he was Undersecretary of Agriculture for Natural Resources. And he was also in the Obama administration at the Interior Department, longtime expert on public lands. Marcus Selig, Vice President of Programs of the National Forest Foundation, on whose board I have the honor of serving. And Leigh Whelpton is Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Network. And I've known Leigh from Adventures in Natural Capital Investment in Costa Rica. Don't ask about the stories. She's a very good surfer. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce these deep experts on nature, Tom McHenry and the whole crew. Come on stage.
There we go, and there's our title. Welcome, everybody. We're going to have our speakers introduce themselves as each of them speak in order to have as much time as possible, and we're hopefully going to have a little bit of a colloquy. I'm Tom McHenry. I'm former president and dean of Vermont Law School, longtime environmental attorney, and board member of the National Forest Foundation. And I just have 2 slides to introduce our subject matter today, which is such an important one. We've been talking about climate since you arrived. You've been thinking about climate. If you flew here, you probably felt guilty about climate. But you look at this slide up here, which I think all of you can see. You can see that natural climate solutions, sometimes called nature-based climate solutions, that's the green you see on the slide. Estimates vary, but perhaps 1/5, 20% of the mitigation we need to reach our goals to keep the earth from burning up can be accomplished through nature-based climate solutions. You've heard some about soil earlier yesterday and earlier today. We're going to talk a little bit about the role that conservation finance plays. We're going to talk about the role that forests play and talk about the role that agriculture plays. Here's a couple of statistics just to sort of frame our discussion today. You can see that the 20% figure, which is the second bullet point there. What's so exciting about this is that good management of forests could account for something like 3/4 or 2/3 of the nature-based climate solutions, another 20% from agriculture, another 15% from wetlands. So tremendous opportunities. If I leave you with one takeaway today at the moderator, is that natural climate solutions are something we need to spend a lot of time and effort working on. So having said that, I'm going to be delighted to turn it over to Leigh.
Thank you, Tom. And how do we pay for that? So I think that's some of what we'll be talking about today as well. I'm Leigh Whelpton, Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Network, and we are effectively a backbone support entity for this emerging field of conservation finance. We emerged from the collective efforts of leading practitioners and organizations, private sector firms, nonprofits, public agencies, foundations across the country, if not world, all trying to figure out how to put innovative and effective funding and financing strategies to use in high integrity, good project work. All right, so what the heck is conservation finance? I've been tasked with a quick explainer on it, and effectively, we talk about a range of strategies that generate, manage, and deploy financial resources, or in some cases align incentives to achieve conservation outcomes. And these funds can be sourced from public, philanthropic, private, or in many cases, blended sources of capital. This emerging field can really help to leverage the money that we need to implement so many of the solutions that the panel is going to talk about today. And certainly we've heard from various speakers at this forum, whether for regenerative agriculture or otherwise. And I should also just give you a sense of why focusing on the money side is important. So we've heard some hints about the money that we need to do this work. I'll give you just one slight statistic. On an annual basis, we would need approximately $800 billion more than we have today just to solve for the biodiversity efforts that we need for the planet. So we have a lot of capital we need to mobilize. It's an all hands on deck approach, and really we need a lot more effort to be put into how we create and deploy these models, how we structure good projects together, and partnerships and efforts and engage communities. All right, so my explainer, hope I won't put you to sleep for 2 seconds, but there are really 5 buckets of how we think about being able to put money into good conservation projects. One of them, conservation-oriented real asset investment. So this is often a buy, protect, and sell model, typical of forestry, farmland, and agriculture. So 2, environmental credit markets, where you're actually creating and or selling some unit of environmental attribute. Often we think about this in voluntary or compliance carbon offsets. Sometimes it can be water quality, it can be water quantity. If you live in the state of Oregon, temperature is a regulated pollutant, and you can actually create units of temperature abatement. Commodity supply chain improvements, really when we think about how our food and fiber is produced, this is thinking up and downstream in the supply chain on how we can embed better practices for producing those products and services. Cost savings and risk reduction, a bit of a catch-all from where we sit, but these are emerging models for insurance, for green infrastructure, for pay for success, quote unquote, projects, which is a fancy way of saying outcomes contracting, and the emerging field of environmental impact bonds. And then there's also, I'm not going to call it simple, I'm going to call it extremely effective, new and leveraged forms of funding. And this is different creative uses of philanthropy. This is stretching public funds, borrowing money to bridge funding. So I need to make these things tangible. This could be acquisition of forest land that would otherwise be fragmented in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This could be carbon offsets related from the sale to net zero commitments of corporate entities. This could be a new farm operating loan rebate program by the Farmers Business Network and the Environmental Defense Fund for climate smart agricultural practices that producers implement on their land. This could be upfront funding for recreation asset development, in this case, a mountain biking trail in South Central Ohio, the state where I hail from, or pointing to Marcus for Ski Santa Fe here, under newer leveraged funding, creating a voluntary charge on a ski lift ticket to benefit the National Forest and good conservation work. So I realize I'm running long. I'm going to speak quickly. And that is just to say, as we've learned, the natural capital solutions are a really critical part of this. The good news is that we have billions of dollars coming from net zero commitments, from the USDA just closed their first RSP process for $1 billion of climate smart commodities. We have full funding of something called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, approximately $1 billion, 900 million. And we really need to increase the core competencies of the practitioners on the ground to be able to land those monies in high integrity projects. It's a lot more money than we've known what to do with in the past. Typically when we give these talks, it's all about there's not enough money, there's not enough money, there's not enough money. And that is true. But right now there's not enough capacity. And so we really need to figure out how to increase the core competencies of people to make sure that the money that is being dedicated to natural climate solutions is landing where it ought to land. So I'm going to stop myself there to make sure we have time for discussion.
Thanks, Leigh. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marcus Selig. I'm Vice President at National Forest Foundation, overseeing our field projects and programs across the country. I'm going to talk today a bit about managing our forests for carbon. And just by way of background, just want to tell you where I'm coming from in this discussion. So my background's as a forest biologist and studied in graduate school managing forests for carbon. After that, went into the legal world and looked at using legal mechanisms, legal and finance tools to support projects to help with climate change, to help mitigate climate change. And then lastly, in environmental advocacy, working for a local nonprofit, trying to support forest conservation efforts. In my current role, what I do is put all of that together to bring the legal side, the finance side, and the forest side to figure out how we can afford to manage our forests the way that we believe they should be managed. It's not a cheap undertaking, and so we have to look for innovative finance mechanisms for supporting that kind of work. And the work that Leigh does with conservation finance and that we do together to support this kind of work is really starting to take shape But I need to go through a little bit of background to explain what the value is there from an environmental climate standpoint and from a finance standpoint. So this photo here is a typical photo of western forests, but I want to specify that this is dry western forests. This isn't the temperate rainforest. These are areas that experience frequent fire regimes. And what we're seeing is past management practices have led us to a forest that is incredibly crowded with small trees like this one. And when you look at this, some of the things that stand out to me as a forest biologist, one is that there's no biodiversity. There's one species here. The other is that it's really crowded, and these trees are competing for resources. They're stressed. And in climate change, that stress is amplified. So these trees, because of water stress, because of temperatures, are more prone to dying from insect attacks, more prone to disease, and they are more prone to fire. When that happens, what we're seeing is that our forests are turning from a carbon sink to a carbon source. We're seeing forests turn over and release carbon, and we're even losing our forests being replaced with grasslands. This is what we see when we have an overcrowded forest burn. And I'm not trying to feed the fire narrative here. I've seen this with my own eyes. I lived in Arizona for a long time, live in Colorado. We see these fires that burn the landscape. The trees often in large areas do have 100% mortality. There is a big emission of carbon from this as the trees are burned, and we lose them and they don't sequester carbon until they eventually come back. The landscape that we see after these high severity fires looks like this. And this also has no biodiversity. This also is not sequestering carbon. And the water effects of this are large. The hydrology is disturbed. These soils aren't absorbing water. It's running off, causing post-fire flooding. And the impacts can last decades. I have forests in my backyard that burned 30, 40 years ago that still look similar to this with some small shrubs coming in. This is what these forests look like historically. The reason that they look like this historically is because we had frequent fire. We had fire that moved through these landscapes, in some cases every 2 to 5 years in some landscapes. And what that did was make less trees on the landscape because the small trees would indeed burn up, and it allowed a lot of trees to survive. It allowed understories to come up and wildlife to flourish. It also created a resilient forest that could withstand that fire, that could withstand times of drought because the trees weren't competing as much, and they were more persistent on the landscape. So how do we get from that state of where we are here to that state of where we want to be? That's where the money comes in. That's where the projects come in, and that's where management comes in. So we do have to do thinning, because if we lit up that small dense fire or forest right now, it would be a big fire. And so we have to bring in machines, and we have to do selective thinning. We're not talking about clear cutting big patches. We're talking about creating space for fire to move safely without getting into the crown. But the thinning is only part of it. The thinning, though, I will say, is expensive. Nobody is making money off this thinning except for maybe a couple operators. To do this work, we're cutting small trees. They have no value. They have negative value. We're paying $1,000 to $10,000 an acre to do this work using philanthropic dollars, corporate investments that I'll talk about. The timber industry, for this type of work, is not pulling valuable logs off. They're pulling small diameter trees. But that's only part of it, the thinning. Where we really need to get to is burning. Burning is a natural process on these landscapes. We need to prepare the forests to receive this fire, and it'll help maintain it into the future. And it's also a lot less expensive than bringing in machines to cut trees. This is where we want to get to create this. So when we look at this, there's a number of benefits that come from this type of forest as opposed to the forest I showed in the first slide. One is water. I mentioned that the hydrology is impacted when these forests burn. We have post-fire flooding, sedimentation going into streams, sedimentation going into reservoirs. Folks want to pay for clean water. Folks are willing to pay for water that comes on a dependable basis instead of floods and drought. And we harness that. So we work with companies that have sustainability targets that are willing to pay for water quality and sustainable flows. So we're putting water payments into forest restoration work. There's also carbon. And the carbon is a really interesting aspect of fire, especially in dry, frequent fire regimes. If a forest burns, you have the emissions from the fire. You also lose the ability to sequester further carbon. What we're also seeing is that in the face of climate change, we're not getting forests back at the same percentage. In states like Arizona, about half the forests that burn in an unnaturally severe way are coming back as scrublands or as pinyon juniper, which has about half the carbon potential as a ponderosa pine forest. So we're losing the actual forest type. So what we have been able to work with scientists to calculate is if you go in and do restoration treatments and don't even account the wood, don't even count for the wood that's taken off the land, if you can just get back to a more balanced ecosystem and maintain that carbon instead of losing it through unnaturally severe fire and losing your forest type, you can gain 20 to 50 tons of carbon per year. And that's a benefit that companies are willing to pay for. And so we have models that run that and can tell us exactly how much carbon we expect to be sequestered or maintained on a landscape and sell that carbon to help pay for the restoration work. If we stack all those different types of funding, and there's a lot I haven't mentioned here, we can get to a forest that looks like this. And that's our goal, is to create a healthy, resilient forest.
So my name is Jim Lyons, and I run a small nonprofit called Conservation Strategies, and have worked in natural resources for many, many, many years, long before climate change was recognized as the concern it is. My colleagues have set me up well. I'm going to try to offer a very simple and short example of how to apply all these tools in achieving a larger conservation goal, which is to conserve a landscape known as the Highlands that covers northwestern Connecticut, the Hudson River Valley, northern New Jersey, and northwestern Pennsylvania. So I'll start with this. This is actually a painting that was done by Jasper Cropsey. He was one of the Hudson River School of Painters, for those of you who are familiar with that. He did this in 1970, and this is Greenwood Lake, which is an area in northern New Jersey, a beautiful place, and a part of what at least those of us from the Northeast consider the birthplace of conservation. So I'm going to take you from this beautiful setting here back east to northern New Jersey. At least my part of northern New Jersey is beautiful. I can't attest to the rest of New Jersey. And the area you see in green there is an area that's been designated as the Highlands. And you can see it spans from Connecticut to Pennsylvania. It's an area that has unique characteristics. Part of it was glaciated many, many years ago. But it is, for the most part, still in a natural state. Yes, there are suburbs and a few urban areas, but it plays a very important role in conservation and in climate change in this area. In 1990, actually, as a result, 1992, as a result of the 1990 Farm Bill, the Forest Service was directed to initially study this area and determine its values. And there you can see, through a survey they did of the population at the time, the goals that people in the region had. And as you can see, it was manage future growth, maintain adequate supply of water, of high quality water, conserve contiguous forests, provide recreation opportunities, and maintain the economic prosperity of the region. So these are the elements that drove this study and a whole host of other studies that followed. The study I referenced, which is up on the top left, a subsequent study 10 years later, a study that led to the expansion of the original Highlands region to include Connecticut and Pennsylvania, and then actually a book that was done 10 years ago by a colleague from Rutgers, in which he referred to the Highlands, if you can read that, as critical resources, treasured landscapes. I know that's hard to imagine in a place like this, but These are really, really important places. And this is what Rick said about this region and the reason that I elected to focus on the Highlands with regard to its climate potential. I'll just let you read that. I think the key there is practices that protect and restore this landscape can help capitalize on the ecosystem services it provides and play an important role in climate mitigation. And that's what this project focuses on. It focuses on capitalizing on these values and these concerns to ensure that we address both the climate problem but meet the needs and the objectives of the population that resides there. I will say this, it's a very rural part of New Jersey. I know most of you out here can think of New Jersey as being red, but Governor Murphy won his re-election by only 4 points. And so people are very conservative. I don't go into the local coffee shop and talk about climate change. However, we do talk about conservation, and we talk about the importance of the forested landscapes in the area and how much people appreciate those areas. The area of the Highlands is still almost 90% forested from Connecticut down to Pennsylvania. The area to your right is a wetland area. 5% of the Highlands is in wetlands, but 40% of the Highlands in New Jersey is wetlands, and plays an important role not only in climate mitigation, but also is extremely important for wildlife. Half the neotropical birds that migrate along the East Coast spend a portion of their time in the Highlands. Native wildlife has been restored to many parts of the Highlands, including bobcat, black bear, which is a bit of a controversy right now, red fox, and other species. There's 9 species of bats that are endangered that reside in this area of the Highlands. The Highlands was a highly productive agricultural land and played an important role in providing milk for the New York and New Jersey milk markets. But with changes in milk markets and changes in consumption, that all went away, and many of those farms characterized by feed silos still remain, but have been idled and left behind. It provides us with a tremendous opportunity, if you saw some of the presentations yesterday, to consider ways in which we could amplify carbon sequestration through better practices on those farms. Right now they play an important role, but through enhanced conservation measures, they could actually increase substantially the amount of carbon that they store. Of course, urban areas are an important part of this landscape, but surprisingly, the Highlands is become a destination resort for many people in this region and plays a critically important role in meeting their water needs, their outdoor recreation needs, and providing support. The point I'm trying to get to here is the conservation finance that Leigh talked about and the conversation we just had about forest management provide important opportunities to not only enhance the quality of this ecosystem and address climate change, but I think most importantly, from the standpoint of those who may be non-believers or people who are skeptical about the issue of climate change, meet their needs, outdoor recreation, protect open space, maintain forested cover, have opportunity, and provide places to fish and hunt and enjoy the outdoors. Some people may think of those as co-benefits of natural climate solutions. In my part of the world, they're critical to being able to implement natural climate solutions. And there's another advantage we have in the Northeast that hasn't been addressed yet that I want to point to, and it's a critical one, and that is we have diversity. The Highlands are within an hour to an hour and a half drive of New York, Newark, Jersey City, Paterson, Philadelphia. These are heavily diverse areas. And the exposure that people have to the Highlands in enjoying outdoor recreation and hiking and camping, et cetera, now includes many people from these communities. And if we're ever to continue to make success in our efforts to advance climate change and conservation, I think we all recognize how important it is that this constituency, people who own the public lands there as much as you and I do, have an opportunity to enjoy these. So we're capitalizing on this opportunity to make sure urban residents understand their connection to the land, to conservation, and what role they can play in helping to address the increasing threat
About 30 seconds, Jim.
of climate change. So let me wrap up by suggesting this. This is how I think we capitalize on these co-benefits to address the universal threat of climate change. One is acquiring lands, and there's a substantial amount of money that is now moving through the Congress, perhaps to provide $20 million a year for additional land acquisition in the Highlands region. Adapting natural climate solutions, as we've discussed. Using market ecosystems and services that people are willing to pay for in this region to continue to do the kind of conservation work that's necessary. Capitalizing on and expanding access for a diverse community so they're part of the solution and understand their connection to the land and climate change. And then I think most importantly, since we're so close to New York, capitalizing on the market opportunities and the financial opportunities that come of all those people in New York who like to go to the Highlands and enjoy the Highlands on their weekends and vacations and help them understand what role they can play in addressing the universal threat of climate change.
Jim, thank you so much. I hope this was useful in seeing some good examples. A good takeaway here is that natural climate solutions aren't just good for climate, they're good for lots of other things. In the 4 minutes we have left, I was going to ask each of our panelists to take a minute each to address one question, which is, what are the greatest opportunities, but what are the greatest threats to advancing conservation finance, good forest management, good agricultural practices? Leigh, you got the head start.
Let's talk solutions. So I would say there are people in the room who represent investment institutions. There are also people in the room who have investment accounts, retirement accounts, et cetera. One of the things that we really need is to figure out how to mobilize more financial resources to come into this space. We also need, from the ground up perspective, the conservation community, the agricultural community, to increase the sophistication of how to develop really good projects. And then we need groups like Marcus's, we need intermediaries, we need people who can be the glue helping to connect the money to the projects. And so the opportunity that I see is really to build those, that support ecosystem to see things happen as quickly as possible.
Threat is the failure to do that.
Bingo.
Okay, Marcus.
Well said.
Time efficient too.
Yeah,
Good.
I think in my world, looking at the 193 million acres of national forests that are across our country and the amount of work that's needed, there's an estimate that 80 million acres are unhealthy right now. How do we get the projects together? Money is one challenge, but if you don't have projects, you can't even spend that money. How do we get the projects moving at a scale that actually can address the scale of the problem? We're seeing some good movement in that regard, but our agencies are not set up for working in that way. We don't have the capacity currently to do it, and that's the thing that keeps me awake at night, is how do we get those projects together to spend that money once we figure out how to get that money?
Money, capacity.
Well, I'll start with the opportunity. The opportunity is to capitalize on growing interest and understanding of the threat of climate change and working in places like this. This is Greenwood Lake 2 years ago, 250 years after Jasper Cropsey painted that famous painting. And that landscape is still intact. And that means people can utilize that landscape. It means that farmers can capitalize on the resources they have and engage in regenerative agriculture, as you heard the last 2 days. It provides tremendous outdoor recreation opportunities, which is driving the economy. And I think most importantly, it helps a larger audience, because of the New York market and because of the communications that come out of New York, understand the connection between climate, conservation, integration, and the opportunities to protect these landscapes and our environment for decades and decades to come.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you to our panelists. We'll be around. I think we're all going to Galena Lodge tonight. We'd be delighted to talk with you about the projects. We'd also like to know about your natural climate solutions, and we're pleased to give Amy an extra 30 seconds of time. So thank you very much.